And in that sense, I thought when I was younger, and I actually wrote one of my college essays on this, that my grandparents or those older adults in my life knew everything. They just had it all figured out. Their view was the right view, kind of sense. And as I got older and I started figuring out my own values and the ways that I wanted to approach life, it kind of created a divide in the sense that I was realizing that they weren't right or weren't right in my mind or had different viewpoints than I did. And that was a shock to me because I had always just held them in such high esteem, and not saying that that went down in any sense, but it definitely altered my viewpoint on how I saw them. And so I wrote like an entire college essay about this because it was just such a significant part of me growing up and realizing that there are different values and viewpoints through generations.
Good evening and welcome. My name is John Saroof. I'm one of the co-executive directors of Essential Partners. We're a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1989, if you can believe it, to help people build relationships across differences, to address their community's most pressing challenges. We collaborate with communities, with schools, with faith institutions and organizations all across the United States to help transform the way we navigate differences of values and beliefs and identities. And when I tell people what we do, these days they perk right up because, of course, the need for this work is just so clear. And of course, they'll ask, what's the most difficult conversation you facilitate? And certainly we're called in to tackle some of the most explosive and challenging issues, things like race and policing, gender, identity, guns in America, political polarization. But what's interesting is that I explained to people that one of the most difficult conversations to have in America today, and who knows, maybe it's been this way for centuries, it's the one we're here to talk about today, an issue that's just as divisive, but doesn't always get the attention it deserves. It's the generation gap. So tonight we'll dive into the challenges and the possibilities, the richness, and I think sometimes the frustration of intergenerational relationships. We've got two multi-generational panels of partners who are going to talk through the difficulties and some of the successes that they have experienced in their families, in their workplaces, in their schools, in their faith communities. And then after each panel, I'll come back. I'll be joined by an Essential Partners associate to just try to unpack a little of what we heard and see if we can offer some insights and some tips. Before we start, I just want to do a few thanks. Thank you to all of our generous donors, as well as our special event sponsor, the Stand Together Trust, for making this free public program possible. So now I'm honored to send it over to Essential Partners Senior Associate, one of my mentors, great facilitator, Bob Staines, the facilitator of our first panel. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you. It's great to join you all tonight. In our first panel, we invited our panelists to reflect on intergenerational gaps in their families and personal lives. And with us tonight are Brendan Keeley, a rising sophomore at UCLA and a trained EP youth facilitator; Sarah Leahy, a rising sophomore at Clemson University, also a trained EP youth facilitator; Ryan Nave, journalist and editor-in-chief of Reckon South in Alabama; and Barbara Simonetti, the president and conversation architect at Meetings That Matter. We began by asking them about the challenges of communicating across a generational difference, times when talking across generations didn't go as they hoped, and times when they were able to communicate across generations well. Here's a little of what they learned.
So I've actually given this some thought, and I guess the biggest difference, or the aha for me, is to remember that the experience of people in their 20s and 30s right now is radically different. The world is radically different than it was when I was in my 20s and 30s and 40s. and to remember that, to resist thinking that I know everything and that they want to hear my advice. So on a very personal level, you can imagine my having a child at 40, there was quite an age gap between us. And when he became an adolescent, it just so happened I was also in menopause. So there was hormones flying all over this house. It got a little bit rough. And I got this idea about how to deal with him. He would come in and he would be upset about something. And I would try to fix it. And then I learned this trick. And the trick was I'd listen to what he had to say. I'd say, okay, here's what I think you just said. I'm really sorry that's going on. And then I found this magic question that went, I have an idea about that. Do you want to hear it? And if he said yes, he really listened and we had a great conversation. And if he said no, I just shut up.
I gave these questions some thought. Like I said a little bit earlier, in my winter term, I had a class that was service learning oriented. So part of our service learning was going to nursing homes in the Los Angeles area and talking with the older adults that were living in them. And at first, that was kind of like, I was super hesitant about that. I thought it was going to be really hard. And I think that really connects to my biggest lesson, or just like what comes to mind when I'm thinking about generational differences, is just approaching it with an open mind for myself. Because like I said, I was a little bit hesitant, but within the first meeting, it was like everyone there was so nice, and it was just such a cool experience, and it started to become like the thing I looked forward to every week. And so, yeah, I really just think that it's about going into it with an open mind, and being ready to not be pompous about it, and realize that even, you can learn from people older than you, which seems obvious, but sometimes feels like it's not. And I think just like maybe if I had to think of like a most notable moment or event from that, it was, so the way it worked is we were assigned a partner that we spent about 8 weeks with. Every week we had about 2 hours of meetings with them, either through Zoom or in person. And so I really was nervous going into it. And the first couple weeks were just, small talk, like, oh, how are you? And then just like getting to know them. But then finally, I started to get comfortable enough to the point of being able to ask serious questions. And that was really where I found the most eye-opening part of the experience, was just like realizing that there's like so much to learn from older adults, as myself being a young adult, especially because I didn't really have like grandparents in my life when I was a teenager. I either wasn't super close to them or they passed away when I was young. So like not having that, I think contributed to part of my hesitancy, and why I was like, oh, there's not much I'm going to be able to gain from this, even though there was so much. And so at the end of the 10-week program, we were doing reflecting. And it was crazy to me because there was about 20 fellow students and then 20 older adults that they were all partnered with. And it seemed like everyone kind of shared the same thing, is like they were super hesitant about it. So it seems like it's kind of generalizable, that, you have to approach it with an open mind. Otherwise, that there's really no hope of having a productive conversation across generations.
I spent a lot of time thinking about these questions in the context of my relationship with my younger siblings, who are much younger than I am. And so like I went to college in an entirely different world in the late 90s. And, they went to college, like after 9/11 and the stock market crash of 2008, and all that kind of stuff. And so, there are ways in which that they talk about the world, and they talk about the lives, and they talk about their lives, and the challenges in their own lives that I have a hard time understanding, because it was just such a different time and place when I came up in the world. And I think also understanding, the different ways in which people come to information, whether or not it's like dealing with younger folks or dealing with older folks. I know a lot of times when I talk to younger people, I have to remember that, like they grew up with the internet, for example, and they've always had access to so much information. And information is so fragmented now that in a lot of cases, it's kind of a process of like them letting information wash over them, as opposed to, I think, having had, slightly limited access to information back in my day. It was really about like seeking out very specific sources of information, and limited sources of information. And so like, even when we have conversations about like what's true or not on YouTube, understanding that like the relationship that a younger person has with information is so much different than what I experienced in coming up. I think, like we could get frustrated talking to people across generations, because it's just like, why do you believe the thing that you think you believe? And, I'm coming from a place of, I've, been following this issue for, decades, or, we've been covering it. And maybe some other folks are just coming to it. And I also think a little bit in the way that is very healthy, that folks of certain generations like create boundaries. It's like getting off Twitter and not watching the news is like such a big kind of self-care thing, which I actually think is quite positive. Like I'm not programmed that way because, as a journalist, I was very much trained to like always be plugged into the news. And so I think, sometimes I get frustrated with folks across generations because I'm like, what do you mean that's not being reported? Like, I saw it on cable news. I saw it on Twitter. What do you mean that, you didn't know, about the fact that like we were getting stimulus checks, or something like that. And it's just kind of wild to me. But again, I think it goes back to understanding that not everybody like lives in information spaces in the same way. I would also say that the same is true in terms of communicating with folks of older generations, right? Because like our folks like still watch the 6 o'clock news, right? They still watch 60 Minutes, and they're not getting information from many sources beyond that. And so, I think it's just, remembering to have grace for people and understanding like their relationships to the world around them, and not, it's not like a, willful, ignorance, or just like a willful like resistance to, trying to, get access to better information.
Yeah, so when I was first reading over these questions, the first thing that came to my mind was maybe not so much intergenerational differences currently, but as I was growing up. And what I mean by that is kind of like Brendan, my grandparents are kind of scattered all over the United States. So I don't really have like the walk down the street to my grandma's house type of lifestyle. And in that sense, I thought when I was younger, and I actually wrote one of my college essays on this, that my grandparents or those older adults in my life knew everything. They just had it all figured out. Their view was the right view kind of sense. And as I got older and I started figuring out my own values and the ways that I wanted to approach life, it kind of created a divide in the sense that I was realizing that they weren't right, or weren't right in my mind, or had different viewpoints than I did. And that was a shock to me because I had always just held them in such high esteem, and not saying that that went down in any sense, but it definitely altered my viewpoint on how I saw them. And so I wrote like an entire college essay about this because it was just such a significant part of me growing up and realizing that there are different values and viewpoints through generations. And I think one of the most challenging things was acknowledging that there are such different views sometimes, and that the biggest way to combat that is by listening, because I've had a lot of conversations with older adults where I just feel like I'm not being heard in that sense, or and vice versa too. Like I completely understand that they might not be feeling heard in that sense also. So I think that the biggest thing, and something that I've actually learned through my work with essential partners in high school, was that active and deep listening aspect of it. And it's come into play so much in my life in the sense that I'm able to take what maybe different viewpoints that kind of struck a chord with me, and instead of just automatically shutting down and being like, oh, they don't understand this, they're not going to understand what I'm feeling, I also have to realize that from their generations, this is how they grew up and how they're raised. And I was raised in a completely different time, especially with modernization and technology being so prevalent. I think that's a really huge part of it. So I think that the key to talking across generations, or what from I've learned, is just listening on a deep level and not thinking about why your viewpoint is the right one, and instead opening your mind up, kind of like what Brendan also said.
I actually wanted to ask Brendan a question, if I might.
Good.
And following from the same theme about taking the risk, when you started talking, Brendan, you said that when you found out you were going into a nursing home, the word you used was fear. And I wonder what you were afraid of or where that fear came from, because that seems to be the barrier that we have to have courage about.
Yeah, so that's a great question. That was something that I really reflected on a lot, because the way it worked for the service setting was we did like weekly journalings. So on top of that, I did my own too, and that was obviously a big part of it during those weeks. And I think it was definitely a mixture of fear and nervousness and just hesitancy overall. Because when I first found out about it, it was a class that I was doing, like it was part of a class. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna, I had the student mentality where like, okay, I'm just gonna do the bare minimum. I'm gonna get out of here. But so I think the biggest thing that I was fearful of was like, oh man, these next 10 weeks are gonna be the worst. I'm not gonna be able to, really connect with any of the people here. I'm just gonna kind of come in, try and do all the stuff that my professor's telling me I need to do to get the grade. And so I was just concerned that it really wasn't going to be worth my time. And I was really just like fearful that like I wasn't gonna it just wasn't gonna be worth it for me. So I think the biggest fear was just like in terms of my expectations going in, and like how I thought that like it was gonna be really hard and there wasn't gonna be I wasn't gonna have anything worth sharing and they weren't gonna have anything worth sharing. And it was kind of just gonna be us doing small talk for 2 hours a week for 10 weeks. But that was really not my experience at all.
Did you guys keep talking after the 10 weeks? Did any of the groups stay connected?
So at the end they shared, we weren't like a big thing with the program, was you're not to share personal information. So even like last name. So, but at the end we exchanged emails. So I've been corresponding with it was an older woman named Shelly. So I talked to her like about like bi-weekly. I'll shoot her an email.
Nice. Great. That's great. And I actually want to throw a question Sierra's way, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. Really struck with what you said about getting to that point where you realize that the elder wasn't necessarily right, quote unquote, and sparked a whole essay. And I wonder if you would say a little bit about how you were able to sort of work that shift from that sort of sudden realization to where you've come to now and you're thinking. What was the process like for you?
Yeah, like I said, I think the initial understanding that my views differed from people that I admired so much it was shocking in that sense, where I was like, wow, like they can have such different views as me, but I can still like love them so deeply in that sense. So I think that because that love and understanding was there, I was able to shift it easier, in the sense where we had already established a foundation. And because I knew what my values were, and because they showed me what their values actually were, I was able to shift my perspective in the sense that I was able to still respect and admire them without having to share the same viewpoints. And I think that one of the challenges, definitely across intergenerational dialogues, is a lot of people don't have that already set foundation of maybe love, admiration, or respect. Just kind of based off of like what Brendan said, because like you're scared of it, or because you don't know them very well. So I think that by building those foundations first would be beneficial, so you don't, maybe not judge as harshly is the wrong word, but maybe you don't take it so personally in the fact that they may have different views.
Wonderful. That was such a rich conversation. I'm so grateful to Bob and the panelists. There's so much to unpack there. So I'm happy to bring in my Essential Partners friend and colleague, Associate Winnie Rugamba. She's going to join me to discuss the conversation we just heard. Welcome, Winnie.
Thank you, John. I'm so happy to be here.
So I want to go all the way back to one of the first things that Barbara said, and I just want to get your thoughts on it. Barbara's technique of asking her child, I have an idea. Do you want to hear it? I'd love to hear your reflection on that.
When Barbara said that, it reminded me automatically about a time when I went to my mom. I had a situation, and I went to her and I was like, hey, this is going on. I want to talk to you about it and see what you think I should do. And so I tell her about it, and then she then tells me what she thinks I should do. And then I was just like, no, I don't think I'm going to go with that. Like, I'm just going to do what I was going to do. And then she was like, so did you come here for advice, or did you come here to inform me what you're going to do? And so I might steal this technique from Barbara and send it to my mom so that maybe she could use it next time. But jokes aside, I do think that what Barbara did is, one, a reflection of courage and also of curiosity, right? I'm not a parent, but a lot of times conversations that I've had with people who are parents always talk about, that fear of hoping that their child is going to be okay, of wanting to protect their children and make sure that they're making the right decisions, without forgetting that what they think is the right decision is based on their own personal experiences and not necessarily on the child's experience, right?
Absolutely.
And so, having that courage of trusting that, okay, my child is out there in the world, I want the best for them, but I'm also going to hope that what they come to me with, I can receive it, and I'm not going to fall into the pattern of wanting to fix it, and also as the younger generation, as well as a child, trusting that you're not going to assume that you know what your parent is going to say about the issue. And even though you might be like, I know my dad, I know my mom, I know this person, I know what they're going to do, I know how they're going to respond, just stepping in and being like, I'm going to try this again, Right. And then, of course, the curiosity aspect of it, which is, I just want to know where you're at in life. Like, talk to me about it and let me hear you. So those are the two things that definitely came up for me as I was listening to them.
It is wonderful to be surprised by your parents, isn't it? To say something, and what they may have said even 10 years ago, they say something different now. We're in a different place, a different relationship. That these relationships between the generations aren't static. They change as we grow. Isn't that amazing?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And go ahead.
I'm curious. I want to hear a little bit about your take on the information, the way you get information, and how that's different from other people. I thought that that Ryan's note about the different ways in which we receive information between the generations can be another sort of huge cultural difference
Absolutely.
that can really change our relationship. Speak a little bit about that.
So I'm home for me is Rwanda. That's where I'm from. And so, for example, I remember my dad, the way his primary way of listening to his news is through the radio. And anything that's outside of the radio is questionable, not legit, because it's not the exact same journalist that's giving him the exact news that he wants to hear. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I'm not going to generalize and say that everyone in a particular generation only receives information in a particular way. But it is true, as Barbara said, we are living in a different world. We are living in a different time. And so having access to internet, having that easiness with technology and adapting and being like, okay, this is an article from Twitter, it can still be legit, even though it's not coming from like, BBC radio, and so right. I definitely know that there is a way that even I, as a millennial, I feel bombarded by the amount of information that is out there on the internet. And so I believe that his name is Ray. He was talking about how, sometimes you do take a break on being like, there's so much information out there, I need to take a break. And so the things that we experience in our generation is pretty similar to what the older generation might be experiencing, just in different ways, and that definitely applies to information as well.
Okay, so I have one last question, and then we have to go to the next panel. But because you came from a different culture, we've heard both of the younger people in this last panel talk about not having relationships with not just the generation above, but two generations above. Grandparents, great grandparents, and how that the gap created a kind of fear for them in approaching. And I'm wondering what that was like for you.
Yeah, I definitely was blessed to be able to grow up with my maternal grandma and my granduncles and my grandaunts, and I think that definitely played a role in how I navigate relationships with older people, whether it's back home or here, right? There is, and also growing up in a culture where like there's such reverence for older people. They know everything. They're their experience, which is true to a certain extent because of their life experiences. They have so much that they carry with them. And so I think that, listening to Brandon's story, for example, where it's like he didn't have that. And so there is a fear that he moved in with because he was like, I don't know what to expect. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times I think that that's something that maybe as a society we need to start thinking about, which is moving from that individualistic aspect of the way we live together. And even though you don't have access to your grandparents, you can have a conversation with your older neighbor. The older neighbor can have a conversation with the younger neighbor, and starting to create a culture that allows people to connect, even though it might be new and starting from scratch, Mm-hmm. And so I think that Brandon actually mentioned something that's really important when it's like, when you don't have access to that thing, you don't know how to navigate that space. And it's something that you have to learn, which does cause a lot of anxiety.
Yes. That's all the time we have right now. But Winnie, can you hang out for a little bit?
Absolutely.
We'll do another panel, and then we're going to bring you back for the question and answer period afterwards.
In our second panel tonight, we shifted the focus to the more public parts of our lives, at work, in our faith institutions, and in educational settings. Joining us are Patrick J. Couillard-Hale, Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Bentley University, Matt Perouse, the Talent Development Manager at Zoll Medical Corporation, and Nehemiah Strawberry, EP Youth Facilitator, trained during our collaboration with the Catholic Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. We asked similar questions of them about the challenges of communicating across a generational difference. Times when talking across generations didn't go as they'd hoped, and times when they were able to communicate across generations well. Here's an excerpt from that conversation.
So I grew up Catholic. That's what I identify as. And my church is blessed to have such a diverse congregation where you have, millennials, you have Gen X, Gen Z, the baby boomers, you have different ages, and as well as just the diversity in the different races that is being represented in my church, as well as the different political, social, racial, just differences, the opinions that we have. And that's why I loved what Essential Partners did, where they partnered with the Archdiocese of Washington to have that civil dialogue, because a lot of people know that, Catholicism is like, we seem to have this like a root opinion on every single issue when it comes to politics, but that's not the truth when it comes to like the youth. Like the Gen Z has a way different opinion on Black Lives Matter than obviously baby boomers or Gen X does. We have a different opinion about abortion. We have a different opinion about all these things that the church has taught us to believe in. And that's why I loved Essential Partners, where they talked about how to have a civil dialogue with the different generations in the church. And one thing that I found challenging when I brought back that dialogue to my church was, so I remember one day we call it Life Teen, where the different high schoolers in the church, there's about 30 of us. And you can really see the differences because the younger generation at my church is very it's very oriented. There's like Black Catholics, Asian Catholics, and Hispanic Catholics. While you look at the baby boomer generation, where it's more older white people, and obviously like the priest at my church will have this set opinion on abortion. And one of the biggest challenges that we found was just understanding each other. So I took that, what I learned from Essential Partners and how to have a civil dialogue, and I took that to my church where we talked about abortion, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, because the Catholic Church has the strict teaching where if you are a Catholic, you must be pro-life. But at the same time, I do have, well, I personally identify as pro-life, but at the same time, it's like, I really don't care. But it's like, I will have those opinions, but then the priest will just, or the priest in like the older generation will just like trying to like demand and force these opinions on the youth at my church, where we would just have to defend like everything. Like recently in the Supreme Court case where Roe v. Wade is looking to get overturned, we talked about that. We talked about how, there's a separation of church and state. And like, I remember I was reading the document that got leaked, and it said something about how Roe v. Wade is not like rooted in the traditions of America. And then we were like, what are we talking about that? Because we have the Establishment Clause that strictly says that you cannot establish Christianity as the main religion of America. And obviously pro-life is a Christian belief. And just like understanding seems to be the most challenging, just like understanding where the different generations are coming from.
So yeah, I love the questions that you had sent us, and the second one in particular, it was about sort of a generational gap gone wrong. Where have you seen it? Sort of a breakdown, and I was just most reminded of the return to work. So here we are, 2 years after the pandemic, and for myself and my organization during the first few months, for the first 6 months really, of the working from home, everyone was so excited to get back to work. We couldn't wait to get back to the office. It was so, exciting. Finally, it became safe to do so. Senior leadership did wonderful things to sort of make us feel celebrated and welcome and all these things. And now, seeing distinctly who has chosen to go back into the office, it falls along generational lines. And I think, sort of 6 months into the pandemic, everyone was like, I can't wait to be there. And now that, people have the flexibility and the option, what you see distinctly, you can almost sort of categorize generationally the folks that you see back in the office. And so, our boomers, as we all know, our boomers they're wordy, they like to talk, they like to discuss, they like to be in the same room and in conference rooms, and that's how they built their businesses and their organizations, and they're back to work. They love it. They want to be there every day. And then you go to our Gen Xers, and they're the sort of, suck it up buttercup generation, the ones that were like, go outside until the streetlights come on, take nothing for granted. And they're very much, they sort of fall into two camps, and it's all based on like productivity, like where do I get the most work done? If it's at work, I'm there 5 days a week, period, in the office. Or if I'm more productive at home, I am at home 5 days a week. At home, I will never go in the end. It's very black and white. And then the millennials, I'm an old millennial. we're the sort of adopter generation. We love technology. I don't know. I still, being on Zoom, feel like I'm in Star Trek every day. I think it's so cool. And the millennials, no one is at work. No one chose to go back because we're like, we have this spaceship called Zoom. Why would I ever need to be there? And then the Gen Zers, technology is not as cool for them because like they've had a phone ever since they were, like as a baby got an iPad to sort of soothe them, and it's just they want to build that social collateral, and they want to be there and connect, and authenticity and individualization and all those things. And so they're in the office every day. And so you look at the portrait of sort of who's chosen to come back, and you've got all the boomers and all the Gen Zers, and then you have 50% of the Gen Xers and no millennials. And that's sort of the sweeping demographic. And I think a lot of leaders were surprised that it was going to sort of break down that way, that these are the folks who would choose to be back in the office every day versus the folks who would choose more of a hybrid or a remote option. So that was the first thing that came to mind. Folks who choose to go back to the office when given the freedom to do so.
These questions have had me pondering on a lot. And as I mentioned earlier, I've done diversity, equity, and inclusion work for a number of years. I've worked in higher ed specifically for about 12 years, but about half of that has been spent doing DE&I work. And a lot of my work has been in the context of education and training, specifically. In a couple of positions prior to my current role, I did a lot of programming, did a lot of sort of development, professional development, learning and development work with a wider campus community at the institution where I worked at. And a big part of what I had worked to develop was a safe zone training program, sort of revamped for the entire institution to be able to partake in. And so, this Safe Zone program, which essentially, is a very comprehensive program, like learning about LGBTQ plus identity issues, matters, et cetera. And I'll speak to a specific, I think I'm going to speak to both the first and the second question with what I'm going to share. But
yeah,
this idea of, what I sort of have really come to sort of understand around issues of equity, justice, inclusion, belonging, is that I, as a millennial, am interested, sort of find myself in this unique space where and I also share my background. I was a liberal arts major, sociology, gender women's studies major, et cetera. So, one of the things that I really was thinking about is the fact that I'm doing a lot of learning and development training for generations, such as, older Gen Xers, baby boomers, who are in service to the population that I, as a leader and college administrator, am actively supporting, which were largely Gen Z students rather. And so sort of thinking about how to bridge that chasm in terms of helping older administrators understand the context of, the climate for LGBTQ plus, youth, younger people across, the stratosphere, and sort of recognizing that there's this gap in terms of understanding and these intergenerational differences where, a great example is the use of the term queer. And, older generations are afraid of that term because for them, that term is an ugly term. Because for a lot of those generations, that term was used as a pejorative one. But for a lot of younger folks, like, who are of my generation and younger, a lot of folks claim that identity as one that is very much part of who they are and that sort of thing. And so it's interesting to sort of see how there's this chasm of, people wanting to be seen and understood and be whole, specifically younger generations, and older generations having this deep struggle with understanding what it all means, because how they understood things when they were younger has changed so much, because identities evolve and identities change. And so it was really, so one of the things that I found really challenging is figuring out how to bridge the gaps between these different levels of understanding so that there could be some sort of free exchange in a way that was also creating safety for people to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel like they belong, to feel like they matter. I will recall this very specific instance where I faced this challenge when I led a safe zone training boot camp, where I basically did all of the sessions that we offered as part of our arsenal trainings for the police department at the institution where I worked at the time. It was a very unique experience in that it was, largely an audience of mostly white, older white men. A lot of them like at different levels of the police department. There was a little bit of diversity. There were some officers of color. There were some women officers, some women dispatcher staff, et cetera. But a larger portion of the audience was white men, uniformed police officers. And there was an instance in which I was illustrating the example of the use of pronouns. As you heard me introduce myself, I use my pronouns. That is something that I was modeling as part of the training, is that for some folks, the pronouns are a way for them to be able to name who they are and, honor their sense of authenticity of personal identity. And it was really challenging to see that, some of the officers were really struggling with this concept of pronouns. Like, why do I have to use like a pronoun other than he or she? And trying to encourage them to sort of see things from a different point of view, but seeing that they were very stuck in this sort of binary way. And so it was hard to figure out how to get them to understand a different point of view while also holding space for compassion for their own limited sort of view of how they saw the world. That was really challenging for me at the moment. I also had a question for you, Nehemiah, that, you mentioned that you're going to be joining Xavier University of Louisiana, which, congratulations, amazing. As a lover pirate, I'm always happy when I hear of young Black individuals like continuing their education beyond high school. So yeah, I'm very excited for you. And I'm also recalling your earlier discussion of your experiences with, the Essential Partners Civil Dialogue in your church community, and thinking about, I'm curious to sort of know what sort of have you learned from that experience that you hope you'll take with you as you enter this new community of learners and peers and faculty and administrators that will hopefully you might hope to contribute or bring into that community.
So what I loved about Essential Partners bringing the civil dialogue to the Archdiocese of Washington is that it taught us to have a proper, formal, civil conversation with someone who disagrees with us. So I remember in like our little breakout rooms, we would have like two people who would go at it of different opinion. Because like I said, Catholics come in all different like beliefs, they have different opinions, what all this and all that. And I remember the people who led our breakout rooms would make sure to say, keep it civil. If you have a question, ask it after everyone speaks. And I really just hope, because I am going to an HBCU and a Catholic school, and I know that Catholics have like way different perspectives on everything. So I just hope that the civil dialogue has taught me how to remain respectful, how to remain understanding, how to remain just self-controlled in like what my voice is and how to contribute that to different communities who may not agree with each other. And I hope that if like in the near future, when I do go to college, because college is very crazy and people have different opinions, I can, keep the peace between different people, because I know before the civil dialogue, if someone because I remember it was like 2 years ago, where the priest would get up on altar and talk about how like Black Lives Matter, how you can say Black Lives Matter, but then not all lives matter, and just go off on like all this tangent. And then like the youth group would go off on him talking about like, we don't say only Black Lives Matter. We're just saying as of now, because it was happening like after the whole George Floyd incident. As of now, Black lives do matter, and they're going to continue to matter until we are equal in society. So we went off on him, but I feel like the essential partners taught me how to remain civil, how to be understanding, because, you know, lashing out on someone who doesn't agree with me, that's not going to solve the issue. That's not going to, you know, keep the peace. So just remaining respectful at all times.
I have a question for Patrick. First of all, I loved what you said, and I wrote it down. An invitation for you to see them fully if someone's using their pronouns. I thought that was so well said. That was great. And so I also, when you were talking, I wrote hard job. You have a really hard job. I don't know how you do it. You should write a book once you figure it out. My question for you is this. Like I said, I know for myself, when I was in school, which was not long ago, I don't think, it was very, very much everyone is equal, everyone's the same, don't recognize anyone's differences. It was, you know, don't ask, don't tell. I don't see color, I think was generated from my generation. I don't see color, I don't see age, I don't see, everyone was homogenized, or even though they weren't, you were taught to see everyone through a very homogenous lens. And I'm not that old. I can imagine that the generation above me, it's even harder. And because I know for myself, that's how we were taught. This is what is appropriate. This is what is safe, respectful, all of these things. How on earth do you bridge that gap? Because it's not teaching someone, and I'm sure preaching to the choir, it's not teaching someone vocabulary. It's literally a mindset of, you were taught this for so long and you thought you were doing it right, but actually that's antiquated. This is the way. So like, how do you do it?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that question. I mean, you know, it's funny when I think about sort of what I've experienced in my own, you know, I consider myself millennial. I'm like sort of close to the cusp of millennial and Gen X a little bit, maybe a little younger, but, you know, the thing that I'm sort of, and to your point, you know, Matt, around, you know, this idea of like, you know, to not see color, to not see, you know, these differences. It's like, we're all the same, you know, like this concept of like, we're all one race, we're the human race, and this and the other. And I think that, you know, there's a lot of good intention behind that. And I think a lot of that is fueled by a lot of the historical movements that have happened in the time before, you know, in the time before I was alive, you know, particularly around, you know, the most common thing that I have heard a lot of folks of all generations, or at least, yeah, I'll say most generations, you know, will often around the time of the MLK holiday, you know, they'll usually quote that like one that one quote from the I Have a Dream speech, you know, like I have a dream that my 4 little children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And they sort of hear that one sound bite, and they think, oh, well, then that's just it. Let's just not pay attention to their race. Let's just think of them as just human. Let's not acknowledge who they are, and this, then the other. And if people understood the full context of that, then they will understood that, at least I'll speak for myself, I want you to care about the content of my character and not define my character because of the way that I look, because of my racial identity. And I would argue that, you know, I think especially what I've seen of Gen Zers is that they are demanding to be seen. You know, they are demanding to be, you know, recognized. You know, even younger millennials, I would say, are in that same camp, where they don't want to be ignored. They want to be able to say, I'm queer, I have a disability, I have mental health, you know, issues, I am a veteran, I am this, I am that, and the other. And to be able to be in spaces where they can be open about who they are without any sort of scrutiny, without any sort of dehumanizing treatment or anything of that nature. And that's true, and that's true for people of all identities, which is, I think, one of the reasons why we have such a division is because I think there is a lot of discourse that is fueled by social media, that is fueled by the internet, which, you know, came into existence when I was growing up, right? And like same for you, Matt, you know, that, you know, now we have this access to this tool that now has all this information, and we now are processing all this information in such a rapid pace, but there's so much to process, and we are only capable of absorbing so much. And so now here we are having to make sense of a world that is so complicated. And like, as human beings, I don't think that we are capable of handling such complications, so that we make sense of it in a way that feels comfortable or palatable for ourselves and that sort of thing. And so that's why we have some of the division that I think we have today on, you know, everywhere. And I especially see it on college campuses where, you know, I actually recall at my previous institution trying to have almost like this dialogue conversation that was inspired by some Essentials Partners training that I received, that, you know, where we were trying to talk about the 2020 election that was coming up, and like, how can we bridge the gap between people who have very polarizing political ideologies? And we created space for that. No one showed up except for a lot of moderate students. And it was really, I mean, it was still a rich conversation because I got to learn from some folks who have a different political ideology of my own, like people who are sort of middle of the aisle. And that was actually really exciting. It was actually really enriching for me and got me to think critically about how I can be more compassionate about people who have a different political ideology than myself, or who might have a different way of seeing the world than I do. And I think there is still this need for us to figure out how do we strip away some of that stuff that keeps us from like that I think and I feel like especially right now, people are just desperately wanting to make sure that they can be who they are without feeling attacked, without feeling policed, without whatever. And this is true of all communities. It doesn't matter who you are. And I think that there's a clear misunderstanding and there's a lot that was lost in translation. And I think we have an opportunity now to figure out how to close that gap and to take some of the noise away and to allow people to just be heard and seen. I don't know how to do that. I'm still sort of wrapping my head around that. But I think I think one critical component is like making sure that we're creating spaces for people to just listen to one another and listen to understand and not to respond. I think that's the key. That's a critical key, is creating spaces for people to listen, to understand. Even if you don't agree, you can at least appreciate another person's point of view. You know, it's like controversy with civility, this idea of like being okay with the point of view being different than your own, as long as you are still able to hold space for your own, but also simultaneously holding space for someone else. You know, there's some considerations that I carry around that, and particularly around like making sure that like if someone is holding a value that is rooted in someone's, you know, in someone not existing, that is where I personally draw the line. But that's something that's a different conversation than just creating space for people to feel seen and heard and understood.
And now I'm going to welcome back another one of my Essential Partners colleagues, Meg Griffith, to talk about what we just heard. Welcome, Meg.
Hi, John.
Tell me, what did you notice? I could listen to them for hours. Tell me what you were picking up on.
Yeah, I wanted to go in so many different directions when I was sort of listening. I mean, I think sort of at a meta level, one of the things that was so interesting to me was how much richer the conversation got when they asked each other questions.
Yes.
When they like listened in and asked into what they were hearing. Did you notice that too?
Totally.
Yeah. And I know like sometimes it can be really hard to do that and to do it well, because, you know, we're not really programmed to listen in particular ways all the time. Like Patrick was saying at the end there, like listening to understand and then to ask a question out of our curiosity can be a little vulnerable to do that too.
Right. Yeah. So often it's like you tell a story, then I tell a story, then you tell a story, then I tell a story. But to ask, yeah, it is vulnerable because we're in some ways either admitting we don't know something or that we're curious and interested in something. And then it also occurs that I might not know how to ask it. So any advice you give on, you know, where the line is or what's okay to be curious about and what's not okay?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it has a lot to do with sort of the spirit and intention of our asking, right? So, you know, and even our tone, you know, like just curious is really different than just curious, you know, and, you know, inviting someone to share something that might be personal to them is also like this sort of mutual vulnerability that can unfold in that moment. Like, I don't know if it's okay to ask, and you don't have to tell me. You know, you sort of do all this like qualifying that can happen, which can feel a little awkward. But I think the quality of the relationship really also dictates how that conversation, how that question and curiosity might unfold for you. So, you know, if you have an existing relationship, it might be easier to ask like a clumsy question that might not always come across right, or as, you know, using the right language to this conversation at the end here of this panel about language. I think it's also like sort of in the spirit of Barbara, like, I have an idea. Do you want to hear it? You know, I have a question. Can I ask it? You know, and getting that like permission to wade into the conversation together can be really helpful too. So.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the term clumsy question. I mean, even naming it, I have a kind of a clumsy question, just sometimes in some ways just takes some of the energy or the charged moment out of it. It gives us the sense that, okay, we're human. We're gonna try to find our way through this together. I want to unpack something you talked about in terms of the language and the changing language, you know, and the way certain words are used in one generation or another, and what you'd sort of noticed in that.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a really fun conversation for me too, because of there are a couple different identities that were named, and, you know, like Nehemiah was talking about all the different kinds of Catholics, and, you know, Patrick was talking about the language of, you know, the LGBTQ community uses, and the reclaiming of the word queer by younger generations. And I happen to be someone who claims both of those identities of queer and Catholic, and that's just a really a lot of my interest in this work and who I am is because I'm always trying to hold these things that other people see as, you know, not going together, like paradoxical. And the language, you know, thing can be really tricky, you know, to sort of know where things have evolved and what feels okay to say to whom, and you know, again, this fear of getting it wrong or you know, inadvertently doing harm by asking a question or using some kind of language can be really tricky. And so, you know, I think go into that with a lot of grace and self-compassion, and again, if the relationship is there, it's a lot easier to navigate those moments together. You know, language means so, like, words just have so many meanings to begin with, that in our dialogue work, as you know, a lot of in the really hard conversations, we have to talk with communities about what kind of language is okay for the other folks in the room to use. If it's an issue, how do we frame that issue in a way that everyone in the room can engage and feel like it's a conversation for them to be a part of. So language is slippery, it's tricky. Intentionality is really important, and knowing that, you know, you're never gonna get it right 100% of the time. So
right. I want to ask about, and there's something that I noticed, and I heard in some other conversation, these sort of generalizations about certain generations, right? And I heard when I heard it, I heard myself making some of these generalizations, and it wasn't until I heard somebody else saying, it's like, wow, we're talking about a whole generation of boomers as this one thing, or, another generation as being all like this. And it made me realize that although I do identify with thinking of Zoom as being in Star Trek, so I identify with that. But that we have this tendency to need to clarify, almost in the way that Patrick was saying at the end. The world is so complex. I need to find some way to boil it down and make sense of it. But it means that we're making these generalizations about huge groups of people. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, also like our brains just want to do that, right? Like it's actually part of how we're wired. It's like an efficiency thing. We want to find the pattern. We want to put things in boxes so we can move through our day more quickly. But yeah, I noticed that too. And I noticed that there was a lot of reactions from the little Zoom button reactions when there were these large, the return to work, like, oh, this group does it this way and this group does it that way. And I just thought, what a human response, right? I think, when we see that similarity in an in-group, it can bring a lot of joy. It can bring a lot of familiarity and a sense of connection. When a song comes on from the early 90s and I'm singing along and somebody else is singing along and knows all the lyrics to this song that, like, I don't know why those lyrics are still in my head, but here they are. I'm like, you know this too? Oh my God, and then from there we make all kinds of assumptions about what's underneath that. Maybe that, like, we assume there's a lot of other similarities that go along with that, which is a really human thing to do. And it can be a little bit of a trap, right? Because like, you met one boomer, I don't know, it's like, of course there are similarities because, we had similar cultural context and socialization and history that happened. And also, like, there's a lot of diversity within our groups. And, so the trick is like thinking about how we push against that tendency.
That's wonderful. I remember a facilitation that I did. We were actually, it was many generations, and we were down at the museum down in Washington, D.C. And we wanted to give the different generations an opportunity to sort of explain a little bit about where they came from and what shaped them. So we had them go around the museum and find a story on the wall that shaped their early life. And they all were, choosing ones and explaining what it meant to them. And it was fascinating to see the way that they reacted to these, events. For some people, it was history. For some people, it was very recent. But they got to really see what shaped them in a way that was pretty powerful as a way to connect people across generations.
Yeah. And, that's such a lovely example of like using the space you're in. And I think you can also ask a question, to elicit some of that story too, right? Because when we're stuck in that generational monolith mindset, or whatever group it is mindset, we forget about the particularity of the human in front of us. And so, asking a question, inviting someone to tell a story that gets to the level of the granularity and uniqueness of who they are and how they think, helps break out of that, those assumptions that we might have, those stereotypes we might have about a particular group, whether it's generational or something else. So inviting people to talk about, what it was like to come of age in a particular moment in time, or to witness something, or to experience new technology or innovation. We've all experienced new technology and innovation. It's just not always an iPhone, right?
Right.
So what have we experienced in our life in change, and how has that shaped how we think about the world? Those are questions that can invite that particularity, that, that complexity a little bit better.
Oh, I love it. Let's bring Winnie back to see, and then turn to the audience's questions, and see if there's some curiosity out there and that we can react to. Winnie, welcome back.
So here's a question from Lauren. If I want to hold a dialogue across generations, can you suggest a few group agreements that would allow participants to feel, quote unquote, safe enough to take risks and be vulnerable in speaking?
Well, kudos for wanting to facilitate a dialogue across generations. I think that's great. I mean, first of all, one of the things that we have a practice of is asking the participants what they need to feel safe enough, which is to say, what will make it possible for you to, share the story, ask the question that feels important to you to achieve your purposes in being part of the dialogue. So what is it that would help them do it? And it occurs that there might be some agreements around language and our different use of language. So that's just one. I mean, certainly asking, but I think agreements about how we use language might be interesting. And either of you have a thought on that?
Yeah, actually, I have two thoughts. I think before even getting to the agreements part, I think that one thing that I've observed, one from a perspective of coming from a different culture and also just interactions on a daily basis with different people, I think that unfortunately we are living in a time where we're just simply afraid of one another, right? Like it's almost like we're afraid to say the wrong thing, because if you say the wrong thing, then you're either going to be canceled or the relationship is done and there is no way that you can repair it. So there's intense anxiety and fear around just being human with one another. And so, when I think about a dialogue like that, just beginning with the framing of saying, we know that we don't have the right language all the time. We know that, I might say something wrong, you might say something wrong, but then we also have an agreement that talks about, and please help me if I miss the word, but not assuming that someone asking for the intention, right? If someone hurts you, right? Not assuming that they wanted to hurt you, but that there might be an intention around behind what they said, and naming the impact that it had on you, rather than just shutting down. Someone mentioned something earlier about, I believe it was Brandon that said something about, I just thought I was not going to understand them when I was going to work with them. And I think that we fall into this trap of being like, if you don't understand something, just shut down. Whereas that's an invitation of curiosity. It's an invitation of being like, I don't understand this and I want to. So can you tell me more? So I do think that even going before thinking about agreements, thinking about how we want to frame and creating a space for grace and acknowledging that we're human, Yeah.
Yeah, those are great. I think I would just add, I think one that we use that's good for all kinds of, people and participants, whether it's generational or not, is to check out your assumptions by asking a question. So putting a pause between I have an assumption and then I'm going to react or respond out of that assumption, but let me see if there's an opportunity for me to check out an assumption by asking a question directly. That would help me better understand whether or not that assumption is correct, and gives the person the opportunity to speak more fully about what they've said before, or, whatever it is that the assumption might be wrapped up in. So thanks to Lauren for that question. Another one from Nancy, it was asking for suggestions for elders forging relationships with young people in your community, people you don't necessarily have an existing relationship with family or some other contained relationship. So this is really about relationship building across generations. So any thoughts on that from folks?
It's interesting. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of the book that somebody wrote, Bowling Alone, in terms of how isolated we've become in our own families, our own, small units. And if you don't have children, in that particular moment to get you out into with the younger generation. I mean, most of my interactions with younger people come because I've got a parade of them walking through my house all the time when my kids bring, kids over. But when that stops, then the question is, what do I do? I think about some of the places where I do come into interactions with older people and younger people. I think about the YMCA when I go and play basketball, and have these interactions with. So sports is a place that I think is a possibility. My particular faith organization tends to have, let's use a little bit older, but it has different generations. Sometimes the arts, if you get involved, certainly volunteering in certain ways, but I've done the theater often because plays have, casts of different generations, and you're spending a lot of time sitting around in the rehearsal room or in the green room. You get these opportunities to interact in a really natural way. So it is about getting out into some of the activities that bridge, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that because it's not like, I mean, it would be a little awkward if you just like walked up to a random person and tried to build a relationship. So what is that entry point that can sort of help smooth that invitation to get to know each other a little bit better? Yeah, I think I was listening to a podcast this morning about paying attention. So I also think part of it is like noticing those opportunities because they might be there if we are tuned in for them a little bit more deeply. I know I'm like in my zone on my walk through the neighborhood, listening to something, not open, not looking for engagement. But when you know it, in the pandemic, this older gentleman, this retiree, saw me every single morning and asked my name finally. He was like, we pass each other every day. What's your name? And it was so lovely, to just have like a more familiar hello and like a quick stop to chat and ask how his golf game was on Saturday, So it's not a deep relationship, but it's a meaningful one. It's being known by someone in my community who is a neighbor, who took the opportunity to break my sort of, tunnel vision and asked me what my name was. So
Wonderful.
What would you recommend people do as like a first step? Where to start if you wanted to have a better conversation across a generational gap, older, younger, like what might be a first step for folks to take?
I was just thinking about the relationships in my life, that I have with people who are older than me. And I remember a specific person from back home. She was our neighbor, and whenever she used to come to visit, she would come and, I'd automatically assume that she's coming to see my grandma. And so I'd be like, oh, grandma's not around, you can come back later, or, and then one day she was like, why do you always think I'm coming to see your grandma? Like, I want to also hang out with you. Like, I also want to know like what you've been doing with your days, and she realized like I had an assumption, and my assumption was that every time Tante Marie comes, she's coming to see grandma. And then she was just like, actually, you're wrong. I've come to see you. And then it shocked me in a very lovely way to where I was just like, oh, like, yeah, actually we can have a conversation, and I think that maybe there is there are ways that, again, going back to like tapping into the humans that we are, right? There is a way to use a tone and to use in a genuine manner, just naming what you want, just being like, I know we sit across each other in the office, we've never really talked, and I truly just want to, I want to get to know about the artist that you're playing at the office all the time. And it starts a conversation that might surprise you. You know what I mean? And needless to say that Marie became one of my best friends and stole her from my grandma. So you never know where being human and allowing yourself to be human can take you. And that sometimes is the entry point that we need,
Mm, mm. I love it. I love it. We unfortunately are out of time. I could have this conversation forever. I love the particular insights that you all have, and the way you both approach these conversations with different generations. I know you both have those relationships across different generations, and they're powerful and teach a lot about it. So thank you for bringing your wisdom and your stories today. Really, really grateful.